Hello again, everybody. This is Ranger Kevin Coons at Chippokes Plantation State Park. I'm coming to you again from the shores of the James River to talk a little bit more about fossils and what people used to use them for. So, if you were to buy this property and you needed to build a house, how would you do it? Well, if you're lucky, you know how to use different resources that are found right there on property. Now at this point you're probably thinking to yourself, well yeah, Ranger Kevin, of course you'd use whatever you could find. But what does that really mean? So of course, the first resource is a lot of what's behind me, trees. In fact, here at Chippokes there was a lot of very large pine trees, and there are bald cypress trees, both of which could have been used to build houses, to put on shingles, and a number of different things. Okay, so we've got the structure down using trees. But what about the foundation? Now, the coastal plain of Virginia is mostly sand and clay. So it's kind of difficult to build a foundation. Further north, they were using stone. There's lots of stone everywhere. But down here, there's really just not that much of it. So how would you do it? Well, brick is one way, and then another thing called tabby. And tabby is a mixture of sand and clam or oyster shells to make a concrete. But that was further south and mostly used by the Spanish. Now by the 1800s, there was a little bit more of an understanding of how to make brick, and not quite to the point of making it mass produced, but one thing that Virginia has a lot of is red clay. So using the red clay, sand, and then using the shells to make mortar, they literally built the foundations of this plantation. In the early stages of building the plantation, one of the first things you're going to have to do is clear away trees. And you're going to need to do that just to make space, but also to help you build your structures. So what that's going to take is something like this, although this is from 1930 and not the early 1600s. But you would take your wood to a mill, and eventually what you're going to get is this stuff. So this is sawdust. Now, if you're building stuff out of the natural things that you can find, you're going to use every little bit to try to utilize it for your best interest. Because remember, otherwise you're going to have to wait until stuff is shipped from England, and right now they're only shipping needed supplies like food and people. So what you would do after you've got your beams and you're starting to build your house, you're going to need to make brick, which is going to take more of that clay, and then you're going to need mortar to put that together. In order to make the mortar, we're going to take those fossilized seashells that we talked about, and you're going to burn them. Here we are in the basement of the river house. For those of you that watched the first video, you would have seen that we're back again, because this is also where our fossil table is, just in the other room. So remember, down on the beach we're looking at the clay that you can find, which has lots of iron in it, making it kind of red. And we have all those fossilized shells, and those weird pieces of iron known as bog iron or bog ore. So when the colonists first came here, they actually had to revert to old techniques to start building new. Now, imagine sailing across the ocean, which took months. You get to this new world, and all it is trees and weird shells and clay. Doesn't seem like you could do much with that, but there's nothing else you could do. So you would have to learn from the indigenous people or take note from your ancestors. So that's what they did. Using clay from the beach and the sand from the beach, you can make brick. Now this brick here is actually from the 1800s, the early 1800s. But you can see it's kind of crumbling apart. And that's because this brick was made right here on property, and my only guess to why it's crumbling so quickly is that they use the sand that you can find here. And because there's so many fossilized shells, the sand will have lots of lime in it, which essentially just means lots of calcium. And when you mix that up with the clay and you heat it to make your brick, it makes your brick super soft. So after a short amount of time and not much wear and tear, you're going to start having brick fall apart. Nowadays, we know you want to use a sand that is high in silica, which is the main basis of sand, and low calcium or lime. So some of the other brick that you can find around the plantation, say you take a look at the brick up at the mansion, the brick mansion, you're going to notice that there's pieces of quartz in it. And that's because they use a quartz-based sand. And that helps hold the brick together for a lot longer. Now with that said, that brick was still made on property, so it's a little bit softer than normal brick, which is probably why they used the stucco that you can see on the front. So the other thing that we're going to see in the basement of the river house, and again, this is the foundation, in between the brick, there's stuff called mortar. So how do you get the mortar? We're going to look into that. Okay. 72 hours, and usually what people did was get a big pile of sawdust, start a slow burning fire on the inside, keeping the outside of it wet, so that it would bake in there for that entire time. And afterwards, you take out the old shells, and you break them up with a hammer, and what you have left is called quicklime. And even today we use stuff called quicklime to make mortar. Mixing it with sand and a little bit of water, and right at that moment you're going to have mortar. So even behind me there's some of the original mortar and some modern mortar, which is made essentially the same way. But we also have plaster. So this is the same way that they would have made plaster, using the natural materials found right on the plantation. So this plaster here, it might have a little bit more of the calcium-rich shell in it, which gives it that nice white texture and color. But if you look above us, these boards are called lath boards, which would have been hammered to joists or boards for structure purposes, and in between you can see more of the plaster. So that plaster is more along the same lines as the plaster or mortar used for the brick, and then the plaster that would have been put on top of that would have had horsehair added to help it stay aloft. Okay, so we've made it up towards our sawmill exhibit site to take a look at what is the start of an iron bloomery. So what a bloomery is an ancient technology where you take iron ore, like the bog ore that we were just looking at, and you put it into this volcano-shaped clay dome. Then, as you drop the ore down the top and you have a very hot fire at the bottom, it starts to melt the iron and separate it from what we call slag, which is the extra stuff you don't necessarily want. Then after a while, there would be a door here made out of a different piece of clay that you could easily break open, and using specialized tongs you could take what's called an iron bloom out so that you can start working with it. What an iron bloom is the iron itself drawn out of the ore, and it's called a bloom because it looks like a big puffy cloud. Okay, so we've made our way over to the Farm and Forestry Museum, and I'm standing amongst what we would typically see in a blacksmith shop. Although this particular exhibit, especially this piece right here, talks about itinerant workers that would be smithing iron on a town-by-town basis. They'd actually travel around and do this. Now, this isn't necessarily the same type of setup that they would have used when they were initially coming to the colonies, but the technology really hasn't changed all that much. So you would need to have some sort of forge, and then an anvil, and lots of hammers and different tongs to work that bloom into something that we call wrought iron, which is essentially the pure iron formed into something that you want to use it for. So simple things like nails or fixes for tools and many other things. So that's why a lot of the small towns or even the larger plantations would have had some sort of blacksmith shop on property, so it'd be a lot easier to work with. Now that we have the foundation settled, talking about the brick that we've made and the mortar that we've made, the plaster to go around the brick to keep it protected, we now have the rest of our structure using, again, the materials that we found right here on property. So the stud beams and the joists for the flooring, those are all from old pine that used to grow here. And the nails, nailing everything together, would have been wrought out of that bloom that we made in our bloomery. So by hand, the enslaved that worked here on the property built this house in the 1800s using some of those old technologies. Now by the 1800s, when this house was built, a bloomery probably wasn't needed. At that time, there would have been a large factory working on ore to turn it into good steel or iron bars, so the blacksmith could just order the bars and then work on the iron right there. But it's essentially the same process, just on a much larger scale.